I'm going to continue the storytelling theme by telling you how I became a UX designer. If you haven't yet watched the 2 videos about my college experience, the end of that story is where I'm going to begin this one. I'm going to cover the 3 years between when I graduated with a bachelor's degree and when I landed my first UX job. Upon graduating from UC Berkeley with a BA in art in summer 2012, I failed to land a job that summer that would have saved me from moving back home to Sacramento. A recent art graduate having trouble finding work? Shocking, I know. But surprisingly, after just a couple of months of job hunting, I landed my first job that would pay me for my creative skills. I fell for a job posting by Minted that claimed to need a part-time junior graphic designer, even though the role basically involved no real design work at all. They just wanted people who knew how to use Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign to proof holiday cards. That essentially means checking them for any mistakes, fixing those mistakes, and then passing them on to another set of eyeballs who will quality assure them. Lesson learned: just because a job posting says looking for graphic designers doesn't mean the job itself is a graphic designer position. During one of my Monday night shifts that forced me to miss the 49ers game, I was anxious to know how they were doing because it was the first NFL start for some guy named Colin Kaepernick, and I was curious to know how he'd perform. At the time, I didn't have a smartphone, so I pulled out whatever dinosaur of a phone I had at the time and tried to use it to get onto the internet. And it just wouldn't. As I sat nervously at my desk, the browser kept loading and loading and loading. I told my neighbor that I was curious about the 49ers game, so he whipped out his iPhone, and a few clicks and a few seconds later he said, "The 49ers are winning 20-0 at the half." I didn't know whether to be more in awe at the 49ers backup quarterback performing that well in his first ever NFL start, against the top NFL defense nonetheless, or in that magical device my neighbor whipped out of his pocket to perform the voodoo of accessing the score of the game in mere seconds. But in this moment in which I got introduced firsthand to the true power of smart devices, I realized I should probably be taking this world of smart devices a little more seriously. So I got my first ever smartphone, an iPhone 4. And funny enough, simply having this phone helped me land my next job, which began just as my contract for this seasonal position ran out barely a month later. That next job was a social media marketing specialist position for a company selling home security systems that users can interact with through a mobile app. So I went from commuting between Sacramento and San Francisco for the last 6 weeks of 2012 to commuting between Sacramento and Fremont for the first 6 weeks of 2013. Those 6 weeks in Fremont were packed with many of those standard lessons young professionals need to learn in their early jobs. By lessons, I'm of course referring to the things that you do and do not want in your future job, and trust me when I say this marketing position exposed me to a lot of the things I did not want in a future job. Like, for example, working each of my first 21 days without a single day off because they asked everyone to work weekends, which came with no extra pay because it was salary and exempt. But perhaps even more importantly, this job made me realize I care more about design than I do about marketing, because occasionally assisting the graphic design team felt much more rewarding than updating the company's Facebook status throughout the day. So, about 6 weeks into that job, I realized I was unfulfilled creatively, professionally, and personally. I think by that time, the mental, emotional, and physical exhaustion got to me. For most of those 6 weeks, I was commuting 2 hours each way between Sacramento and Fremont, mostly in the form of half-asleep driving. My commute forced me to wake up each day at 5 a.m., and I wouldn't get home until 9 p.m. And on one of the drives home, the wear and tear on the truck I use daily eventually led to one of the tires popping loose, causing me to spin out of control on the freeway near Davis. Thankfully, when I spiraled across the width of the freeway, it was far enough away from the other cars for them to have enough time to avoid smashing into me at 70 miles per hour. At that point, I had enough warning signs that I shouldn't keep going like this. So, 4 days after a somewhat disappointing Valentine's Day of unrequited love, an emotionally and physically exhausted Raymond decided at the end of one of his shifts to discreetly remove the name tag from his desk and leave his work laptop in the office instead of bringing it home like he usually did. The next day, the company's human resources team arrived at the office to an empty chair where I loyally sat for 6 weeks, and an email explaining why I could no longer continue. With this burden finally off my shoulders, I now had to deal with a more insidious burden: permanently moving out of my family's home. That would require my next job to be more sustainable, so I needed 3 things out of my next job. 1, it needed to pay enough for me to cover both moving and eventual living expenses within a reasonable time after getting hired. 2, it needed an office I could reasonably commute to for weeks or months before I moved closer. 3, it needed to be enough of a creative outlet for me to not long for something more fulfilling. I'm going to spoil the timeline for the rest of this journey to sort of map out where I'm going with this story. Here was my first day after quitting the marketing position, and here was my first day as a UX designer nearly 2.5 years later. Looking at a timeline this lengthy may worry aspiring UX professionals, but I assure you the journey shouldn't take as long for you once you realize a career in UX design is what you want. At the time I walked away from my marketing position, I thought I knew what I wanted, but I didn't. Throughout the rest of 2013, all of 2014, and the first half of 2015, I applied to thousands of creative jobs with fairly consistent results. At worst, I submitted hundreds upon hundreds of applications that either got ignored or got rejected with no real feedback. At best, I landed interviews where the companies said they liked my personality and my work, but just decided to go with other candidates. Throughout those dark ages of unemployment, I frantically expanded my digital creative portfolio by dabbling in just about every creative field, trying to absorb everything I can about those crafts in order to gain an edge over other candidates I competed for open creative positions. This came from watching movies, observing the real world, and examining why basically any given thing exists, watching YouTube tutorials about art and design, browsing endlessly through creative portfolio websites, and watching as many free documentaries as I could about creative innovation. Looking back at my creative work between 2013 and 2015, I spent much of 2013 developing 3D skills such as architecture, urban design, and industrial design. Apparently, after realizing I'd probably never get hired to do any digital 3D work, I transitioned into a more graphic design focus in late 2013. After dedicating most of 2014 to developing graphic design skills, sometime in the last quarter of that year I discovered the wonderful world of UX product design, because this is when some of the earliest UI designs appear in the archaeological caves of my old hard drives. As you can see, some of these designs are crude, to put it kindly, but every designer has to start somewhere. This portfolio of raw work slowly improved over the opening months of 2015 and even landed me some interviews, but no job. So I decided to go all in on one project that would hopefully convince an employer that this aspiring UX designer with no experience is worthy of a junior level position. One of my favorite things in life is chocolate, which may or may not be related to my lifelong loneliness, so I decided to design an e-commerce website featuring major chocolate brands. I included wireframes, made it responsive, and eventually created the visual user interface, making this the first project in my portfolio to include all of these deliverables. I chipped away at this for a couple of months before coming up with something somewhat satisfying to my then untrained eyes. But it was enough to land an interview at a pharmaceutical marketing agency in San Francisco. Their interview process was quick and painless. There was no annoying phone screen. They just asked me to come in for an in-person interview where I met with one member of Human Resources, followed by the User Experience Design Director, followed by the Executive Creative Director, and then again the aforementioned HR to discuss a targeted salary. A few days later, I got a call with an offer, signed the paperwork they mailed to me, and began the first day as an Associate Interaction Designer on July 20th, 2015. Words can't describe how much better those 3-hour train trips to San Francisco felt than those 2-hour half-asleep drives to Fremont felt.